Hi there, I'm Alyssa Thalen, and welcome to the Laker Lessons. Laker Lessons are virtual learning experiences for K-12 educators brought to you by GVSU. In this lesson, we're going to talk about student assessment in a post-COVID world. Helping us tackle that topic is Dr. Vanessa Kiesler. Dr. Kiesler, an educational consultant and assessment and accountability expert. She was the former deputy superintendent at the MDE and has more than 20 years of K-12 education experience at the state and local levels. And let me tell you, we are so excited to have you here today. Thank you for being here and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us.
Alyssa, thank you for having me, and thanks to GVSU for having me be part of this important Laker lesson. Like Alyssa said, we're here to talk about assessment in a post-COVID world, and hopefully there actually is a post-COVID world coming at us, but certainly we're moving into a different phase of how we're approaching education. We have a couple objectives today. One, we want all of you to learn about the importance of a comprehensive and balanced assessment system, particularly in the context of this world we're starting to move into. And then the second objective is to challenge all of you to think about the ways in which different types of assessments are being used in your schools and your districts. So I think the big question on everybody's mind is, when we are back to normal or something kind of close to it, what should we focus on with assessment? I also think this question gets conflated with a second question, which is, I have no time for assessment. I have to get kids back into schools. I have to teach them content. I have to figure out how they're doing social emotionally. I have to contact families. I have to clean the desks. Like, there's a lot going on. So it can feel like assessment is maybe the last thing on anybody's mind. But I think we want today to take a moment and emphasize that assessment isn't outside of learning, it is part of learning. And leveraging it in that important way will be really helpful as you work to support your students. And to do that, I think the thing we really need to focus on is a comprehensive and balanced assessment system. So you might be saying, what is that? What does that entail? There's a couple things when we think about a comprehensive, balanced assessment system that I want to highlight. And the first is the most important, that there are two purposes of assessment sometimes. Assessment for learning, so how we're using assessment to help us drive learning experiences, and assessment of learning. We've done some learning, how did it go? And I do want to take a minute and say, assessment has become an event. It's become something people dread in the education world. It's also been overused for purposes that it wasn't intended for. But the real purpose of assessment in an educational setting or in other settings is simply to understand how we're doing so that we can drive continuous improvement. And I think now is a great opportunity to get back to that core purpose and use those assessments in that way, again, to support student learning and stop thinking about it as this gotcha or this bad thing that happens to us, but rather something we can do as educators in support of our shared goals. A comprehensive and balanced assessment system will be, as the name suggests, comprehensive. So it would include a variety of high-quality assessment tools and practices, and these will be both formative and summative approaches, and we'll talk about both of those throughout the presentation. It's also, this one is maybe the most important, I think. It's coherent. So all of the elements of the system work together, are measuring toward the same skills, that they're pulling together so that when we're giving different types of assessments, we're using different types of tools, they're not separate or divorced from the content that we're teaching, our learning targets, our objectives as a system, and that we really understand how each piece of the system can work together toward that learning. And then the third C of a comprehensive balanced assessment system is that it's continuous. I already said this once, but you'll hear me say it throughout the presentation. Assessment really isn't an event. It needs to be an ongoing process using a variety of formal and less formal methods. A comprehensive and balanced assessment system, it finds that balance when there's appropriate information, both in terms of the type and the quantity is provided to all relevant stakeholders. So too little information from assessments is bad, but too much information is bad as well. It becomes hard to say, what am I supposed to deduce from all these facts, especially if it's not coherent, going back to the previous slide. If you're a parent and you're getting you're getting results on 4 different assessments and they tell you 4 different stories about how your student is doing, how do you know how to best support your child? Same thing as a teacher, same thing as a principal and a superintendent. And then the second part is also critically important, and something that is not totally in the control of school leaders. Some of it happens at the state and federal level, but there's still something we can do about it. High quality assessments are designed for specific purposes, and then they need to be used for those purposes. So if an assessment is meant to be used in a formative manner, in that assessment for learning, and you use it in a high stakes manner, that's not appropriate. That's not going to get you the result that you want. So it's really important to understand what the assessment is designed for, and then use it for that purpose. And I say this isn't all totally within the control of some of you watching, because I would argue that there have been ways that state and federal laws over the past 20 years have used, in particular, high-stakes summative assessments for purposes for which they were not meant. And that may be surprising to you. You may think, oh, wasn't she just at the department and didn't she work on a lot of those policies? Yes. And I think that's why I can say we have not always used the state summative assessment in the appropriate ways. And that's why people have become more fearful of it, because using it for things like high-stakes teacher evaluations, while it was designed, the state summative assessments were designed to give really good information about a student's progress, content standards, and it was especially designed to give really good information at a school and a district level about how we're doing as a system. So when you have the result from only one student, it's there's some lack of clarity about is that really how the student would perform. If that student took an assessment 10 days in a row, they would not perform exactly the same each of those 10 days. One day they might be really excited to take it and do great, and one day they might be tired and do a little less well. So at the individual level, there's more error, more uncertainty. But when you start to aggregate to the school and the district level, the information becomes more solid. If you look at a school and you see that all kids are struggling with a certain math standard, that's a real finding, and it's something that a school can do something about. They can do more professional development. They can look at the curriculum. They can understand how kids are engaging with the content in and out of school. There's actions that we can take. State summative assessments were really designed at the school, district, and state level, but they've been used for purposes for which they weren't intended. And so that's a good object lesson about why we need to, as we move forward, ask ourselves, what's the purpose of this assessment, and then use it for that purpose. And I do want to take a minute and note, there's a citation on this slide, and in the description for this event, there are more links. I'm borrowing and using Michigan's definition of a comprehensive balanced assessment system and resources from the Michigan Assessment Consortium and the FAME project, Formative Assessment for Michigan Educators, both because it's great content and also because it's really important that we as a state not have competing definitions of these things out there. So this is how the MDE will talk about comprehensive balanced assessment. This is how hopefully your ISDs, your school leadership, we need to, as an education system, use the same language. So not only is it really a great resource, but I want to make sure that we're not introducing new language and new concepts in with this Laker lesson. Returning to this concept of assessment should not be an event, but a practice. This becomes even more important, and this is where that assessment in a post-COVID world comes in a little bit more. This is important all the time, but as we enter into this new year, as we close out the school year that we're in now, and kudos to all the educators out there for what you've done in the last year. It's just been heroic. It's been amazing. It's also been hard. We've had to figure it out on the fly. And as we close out this year and look toward the next year, it's that time when we can stop just solving the most immediate problem in front of us and, stop the bleeding, so to speak, and think more about how can we be more proactive? How can we get ahead of what we know some of the challenges are going to be? And that's where using assessment as a practice is going to be so important. We need to be able to work as a whole educational system to figure out where students are in their learning and adjust instruction to meet their needs in new ways, likely. We know, both from personal experience and from all the research, that the pandemic did not impact all students equally. Academically, not all students were impacted the same way. Social, emotionally, mental health, all of that is going to be different. So having the ability to use the tools of a comprehensive and balanced assessment system to not use one-size-fits-all approaches to helping students recover from the pandemic is going to be critical. And again, knowing the purpose of each assessment and not doing assessment just for assessment's sake. An assessment alone, just given because if you don't know why you're giving it and you don't know what to do with it and you don't do anything with it, then it actually hasn't been a helpful tool. It's just something you did that day, probably instead of something that would have been more helpful for kids. So making sure that we know the purpose and we use the assessments to support students. And ask that question, like, why are we giving this assessment? How is it going to help us? I've already talked a lot about formative assessment practices, and I'm going to talk even more about it right now because formative assessment practices really are key. One thing I want to note as I go into this slide is that you hear me saying formative assessment practices or processes. Formative assessment is not a test. It's not one thing. You can't go to the bookshelf and pull off the formative assessment test and give it to kids. It is instead a planned, ongoing process used by all students and teachers during learning and teaching to elicit and use the evidence of student learning to improve student understanding of learning outcomes and to support students to become more self-directed learners. And again, this is the definition that the Michigan Department of Education uses, and I like that it highlights that it's a process, a planned, ongoing process, not a thing that you do on Tuesdays, we take our formative assessment test. We'll get to those. There are 3 big guiding questions in formative assessment. Where are we going? What does the student understand now? And how do we get to the learning target? And again, formative assessment emphasizes both the teacher and the student being engaged in that question of where are we going and are we getting there? So as opposed to just the teacher saying you did it or you didn't, the student doing some self-assessment, some discussion of their learning targets. Now, keeping in mind those big guiding questions, there are several components and elements within them. So when we ask where are we going, that has 2 pieces we need to keep in mind. One is planning. A formative assessment is a planned ahead process. It's planned actually at the time that you're planning your instruction. So I imagine all of you watching are familiar with lesson planning, right? And you probably turn in lesson plans or have some sort of process to do it in your classroom, at the school, possibly even at your district. Formative assessment should be planned at that same time. So it's not a last minute thing or it's not after the fact, but as you're thinking about instructional practices and student engagement with content, how are you going to deliver that content, and then how are you going to elicit that evidence of learning, which was the 3rd component. The second thing is learning target use. So written in that student-friendly language, how do we write learning targets that help students understand what they are learning, how to reach the target, and what success looks like once the target is reached? Moving into what does the student understand, that's the second guiding question. That's where we have to elicit that evidence of learning. And this is, I think, what people tend to think about as formative assessment, really the 3rd component, where teachers ask questions. There's some evidence of learning through a variety of methods, a portfolio or a written assignment or a quiz or a verbal discussion or all sorts of checks for understanding that teachers can do with students. That evidence of learning is what we use to help teachers and students understand whether or not the students are working toward that learning target. And then the last guiding questions, how do we get to the learning target? The first part of that is that formative feedback, either written or verbal, ideally both, but from the teacher to the student and possibly to student of themselves or even peers to students. How did you do relative to the learning target? What feedback do you need? And then I think the 5th step is always the most important, personally, the instructional and learning decisions. You'll hear me say throughout this webinar and always, if you just stopped after step 4 and you didn't go to step 5 and you didn't say, okay, what needs to happen next? Do we need more instruction? Do we need more practice? There's mastery. We actually can move on. The child has met this learning target and doesn't need to study it anymore, doesn't need to be exposed to it anymore. Using the steps above to make those instructional learning decisions is really a critical part of the formative assessment process. Moving beyond formative assessments, if you can kind of think about assessments on a continuum from less formal and more frequent to more formal and more infrequent. And so over here on that less formal, more frequent are those formative assessment processes. In the middle somewhere are your benchmark assessments. Benchmark assessments are those 2 to 3 times a year check-ins. They are more formal. They are generally built to measure content standards. So those state content standards, the benchmark assessments are checking progress toward that proficiency on those content standards. If you give that fall pretest, that lets you have an understanding where the students are at when they come in terms of their knowledge and proficiency on the content standards. And then if you give a benchmark throughout the year, again, it's that you've been doing your formative assessment practices, you've been setting your learning targets, that rapid cycle. These are these little bit deeper dives, a little more formal to say, are we getting there? Are kids getting proficient? Where might we be falling short? And where might we be done? Like, again, part of it is move on. Don't keep delivering content around an area where kids are already really getting the information and really know it. Benchmark assessments definitely need to be used in conjunction with your formative assessment process. On their own, they're just going to tell you a little bit of information about how the kids are doing on the content standards, but it's not going to help you move kids forward on that daily and weekly basis like you need to be doing. In Michigan this year, the benchmark assessment landscape is a little different, and this is likely familiar to all of you, but just to remind everybody, when the Michigan legislature passed the Return to Learn laws, Public Act 149, it required the administration of benchmark assessments this year in the fall and again in the spring. So this is really the first year that Michigan has had that kind of requirement on the books. So in previous years, it might have been more of a discussion of, you should think about benchmark assessments, but this year, you are all doing it in some way, shape, or form. And I'm actually going to have Alyssa talk a little bit about NWEA, which is a very popular and widely used benchmark assessment that many of you are likely using. Alyssa?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about NWEA, and as she mentioned, the reason why we do it, getting that information about students, it's more infrequent than the formative assessments. But NWEA, we've been working with them for a long time, and we support our schools with this platform, as it does have many resources for you to inform instruction. So you'll get the information on their proficiency and their growth and use that to tailor your instruction, which is a great resource that we have at our fingertips. So on the slide, as you can see, there's a great source for everyone to go to with teacher resources, technical support, using this as part of your requirement this year to its fullest capability to really help students achieve. So super excited to just plug that in there, because if you need anything, please let our office know and we will support you in any way we can.
Thanks, Alyssa. And finally, I did want to take a moment and talk about state summative assessments. Again, going back to that continuum from more frequent, less formal to less frequent and more formal, that's where those state summative assessments sit. This is where the hot topic element of this presentation comes in. As of this taping on February 25th, Michigan state summative assessments are scheduled to proceed as planned. The Michigan Department of Education is preparing to administer them. Districts all should be preparing to administer them as well. But there is a lot of question marks around this. So to briefly summarize where we're at as of today, Michigan did submit a waiver to the federal U.S. Department of Education and asked for what essentially amounts to a blanket waiver of all of the assessments, the MSTEP, the WIDA, the MyAccess, and they were waiting for a response. And then on just a few days ago, actually, the U.S. Department of Education published a letter to all states saying, we are not going to give out blanket waivers for assessments. We will waive some provisions of accountability, but we're not going to just waive assessments. We think it's really important. This is what USED said. We believe it's really important to get this information from a transparency and an equity perspective, to know where every student is so we can direct resources at them more effectively. That's critical coming out of the pandemic. So we are expecting states to give these assessments. Michigan put out a press release right after saying, we understand, we would like you to give us permission to give our benchmark assessments that I talked about just a minute ago as our state summative assessment, or in place of our state summative assessment, just for this year. And so that's where the question mark stops. Will USED accept that waiver? Will they say no? It is up in the air right now. But as of today, the assessments will proceed as planned, and you should keep a close eye on your Thursday communications from the department, the assessment spotlight. I'm sure they will keep you posted if there are changes or as their negotiations with the Federal Department of Ed proceeds. And before I talk a little bit about my suggestions on the state summative assessment, you know, I did want to go back in time just a little bit and say the reasons that the Biden administration gave for wanting to give assessments this year, that transparency and equity, actually harken back to the reasons we ever started with state summative assessments for all students. I think people tend to forget this because there's just been so much that's happened, and again, some of that use of assessments for different purposes. But the original intent was actually driven heavily by civil rights groups who said it is not equitable or fair that we don't know where all students are performing. That's how students can get lost. That's how systemic inequities can be further perpetuated. If we can see it, then we can fix it. We can help direct more resources. We can make sure all students get access to high quality educational opportunities. That was the original intent, and I think that belief is still there and that purpose is still there. I think where we've struggled is to follow up with resources and supports as opposed to labeling, naming, shaming, or just continuing to diagnose gaps in opportunity. It's also driven some negative narrative about why those gaps exist. So I think that layers on top of that original intent. But still, if we can see where all students are performing and we actually want as an education system to approach things more equitably, we can use those data to target more resources and give more opportunities to kids who are not currently getting those opportunities like they should, like we want them to in our educational system. So assuming the state summative assessment proceeds this year, here's a couple things I would just say to be careful about. You should use the data from those assessments very cautiously. You should use them, but you should use them cautiously. And I think there's pretty good agreement about this across the political spectrum. You know, whether you want the assessments to be given or not, everybody agrees they should not be used for high stakes purposes. And we should understand that they're not at the level of clarity or cleanness that they might be in a normal year. So specifically, be really careful thinking about your trend lines. You didn't have any assessment data from last year from the state summative assessment, so you're going back to 2019. So if you think about a line going up, and then there's nothing in 20, and then 21 is somewhere, you know, it might be low, might be high, it's a little hard to tell. It's not really continuing that previous trend. It's really a new baseline. Coming out of this really catastrophic and fundamentally disruptive event that we've all been through or experienced. It's not really an event, it's bigger than that. It is a new baseline from which we can move forward. Understand, we talked earlier about that error band, you know, the confidence that we are sure that that test score really tells you that student's actual knowledge and proficiency on those content standards. That error band is probably larger this year. Some kids are just heading back into school in person now. Some, they're going every other day. They're disrupted. There's a lot of things going on for kids that'll mean that score will be probably even less representative of their true ability than in a normal year. But you should use the data for continuous improvement. And we're going to talk more about that at the end of this presentation. But not for high stakes. So it's not a good year to use them to make really high stakes decisions. I know the MDE is advocating with the legislature to not use them in things like teacher evaluation and the read by grade 3 law. Those would be examples of high stakes decisions that probably wouldn't be supported this year off the assessment, although it does take legislative action to change that. So that is also one of the question marks, one of the reasons this is a hot topics presentation. But in your school and in your district, you can use them for continuous improvement and not for high stakes purposes. You can make those decisions and definitely do use them for those continuous improvement reasons.
Vanessa, I think this is all really great information, and I think to sum up a little bit, is there a way you can kind of give us some practical tips and places to go, resources that you feel would be helpful for the viewers today?
Sure, I definitely can. And again, we will put the links to these things will be in the description for this event. Here's a couple practical tips that I would leave with you today. Consider talking really carefully as a school team about your assessments. It might be hard to raise the question, especially if you're not a school leader, if you might think I can't ask that, but there are some resources that we'll put in the description, some questions you can walk through with your school team that get you at why are we giving this assessment? How are we going to use it? What's its purpose? Are we using it for its purpose? Is it adding to our ability to support our students this year? And if the answer is no, then there's a hard question about, well, can we stop giving it? And I know it's not always that easy to just stop giving assessments. And I know some of you are thinking, well, we'll just stop giving the state summative because I don't want to give that. But as I said, there are good purposes for the state summative assessment, and that one you have less of a choice on. But do look at your assessments. Something we found over the past 10 years is many districts are giving assessments and they don't really know why they're giving all of them. It's just they started giving this one 5 years ago, and then a new superintendent came and they started giving this one, and now they're giving both. Maybe you don't need both, and then you're testing just for testing's sake. And again, I can't stress this enough, focus on your formative assessment practices, those regular assessments for learning. And if you need help, if you're thinking, well, this was a helpful overview, but I have lots of questions, there are lots of answers available to you. The MDE, particularly through the Formative Assessment for Michigan Educators, or FAME project, puts out a number of online modules, toolkits, one-pagers, different things that you can use to drive up your formative assessment practices. And the Assessment Learning Network, which is part of the Michigan Assessment Consortium, also puts out those resources. So please use those things. They're really high quality, they're geared toward educators, and they will help you increase your ability to use formative assessment practices effectively. Although this is an assessment presentation, I want to just keep encouraging all of us that other measures matter too. So academic assessments, we all know this, they are not the whole story, not in a normal year and certainly not right now. Students have been through these traumatic experiences. We've all been through this traumatic experience of and I hate to use the word, but an unprecedented event, a situation that's happened in our lives. So how kids do on an academic test is certainly not the whole story. So looking at other points of data and taking the whole child into consideration is critically important. What do we know about their attendance? What do we know about their social emotional skills? What do we know about their mental health? You know, we don't always have great data, not like assessment data, like in a spreadsheet, but you have anecdotal data, you know things about the students. So remember that the whole child matters and that academics are not the only thing that we're doing as a school. You all know that day to day because you're educators, so bring it in the assessment conversation too. And I wanted to take a minute and say, continuous improvement, that's what we should be doing this year. And luckily, we're in a great year to do that because Michigan is rolling out a new approach to continuous improvement, Michigan's Integrated Continuous Improvement Process, or MyKIP. So as I've said all along, the point of assessments is not just to give assessments or to be punitive, but it's to drive this continuous improvement. So if you're thinking, I don't know much about MyKIP, I'm going to give you a brief summary and then show you some resources as well. MyKIP is a new way, a new mindset to approach continuous improvement where you think about systems and the whole child. And it provides a new platform, a web-based platform that brings, remember those multiple data sources I was talking about earlier? MyKIP brings those together for you so that you can do that continuous improvement planning across whole child data without having to find all that data on your own. It makes it easier for you to have a whole child view of your needs assessment process. And then you can build that high quality continuous improvement plan. Now I know you have written a lot of plans this year. You've written extended continuity of learning plans, you've written plans for your board, you've written plans. And I know there might be people thinking, I can't possibly do another planning process, and especially not a new one. Please just leave me alone with the planning, state of Michigan, I'd appreciate it. And I empathize with that. But I still would really urge you to get into MyKIP. MyKIP is ready when you are. The department is not enforcing, requiring participation in it, but it will really help you. And here's why. Like we talked about earlier in this presentation, it's been a year where we've just tried to get through. We've tried to make it happen. We've had to solve the problems right in front of us. But we are at a point where we can sit down, take a deep breath, look at the data, and put a really high quality plan in place going into the next year. And once you do it in the MyKIP platform, you can set monitoring and evaluation targets, and it's always there. You can export it to different plans, you can adjust it. It's an investment of time and work that will pay off both in a much better educational approach for your students coming into the next school year, but also for you administratively. Less work on the back end if you put a little bit of time and effort in on the front end. So if this sounds great to you, and I hope it does, in the description, we have links to the MyKIP webpage, the professional learning bites, and other resources that I mentioned today. And then get into MyKIP, use it. It's really cool, and you will like it, at least you'll like what it helps you do as a school team, I think. You'll find it a powerful tool to drive your continuous improvement. And do take advantage of professional learning opportunities that the MDE and ISDs and other people are offering around the MyKIP process. And we put links to those in the description as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for taking time to learn more about a comprehensive and balanced assessment system and how it can help you as we move out of some of our COVID-focused educational experiences.
Absolutely. We really appreciate all the wealth of knowledge you have shared with us today, Dr. Kiesler. And thank you guys for joining us for this Laker lesson. For more lessons and other professional education opportunities, please visit gvsu.edu/CSO and check out what is offered under the Professional Education tab. See you later.